It was just another empty stretch of Kansas highway until a single dad saw a flash of white on the roadside and stopped. He didn't know that choice would unravel a hidden legacy, 2 abandoned siblings, and a mother's last hope folded inside a child's memory. What he did next changed 5 lives forever. If stories of quiet heroes and everyday miracles move, you consider subscribing. We tell the kind of stories that stay with you. Now, let's begin the journey. The Kansas sky stretched out in a muted orange blaze, casting long shadows across the dusty country road. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel suspended in time, as if the world was holding its breath. Jackson Ford tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his aging pickup truck and squinted at the horizon. The radio crackled softly, playing a Johnny Cash tune he barely heard. His mind was elsewhere on dinner, the medications, and whether his daughter would let him hold her hand tonight without flinching. She hadn't spoken in 3 years. And sometimes the silence in his cabin echoed louder than any storm he'd ever weathered. Then he saw it. A flutter of white moved across the road so sudden and soft that he nearly missed it. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't wind-tossed trash. It was fabric. A scrap of something pale and waving like a quiet signal from the edge of the world. Jackson braked hard. The old truck lurched to a stop. The engine coughed and settled into silence. He stared out at the empty road, heart tapping against his ribs, trying to decide if he was chasing shadows. But something in his gut, the part of him that had been a firefighter, a husband, a father, told him this wasn't nothing. He stepped out. The wind was cooler than he expected. Dry. He scanned the field, then spotted the edge of something white, tangled in tall grass on the shoulder. And just beyond it, tucked in a shallow ditch, was a child. A girl. Tiny. No more than 6 or 7. She sat cross-legged in the weeds, holding a threadbare stuffed bear, her cheeks streaked with dirt. Her eyes, big and unblinking, locked on his with a calm that didn't match the moment. Jackson dropped to his knees in front of her. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly. Then, in a voice that barely rose above the rustling grass, she said, "Please, help my brother." She turned and pointed. Jackson followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold. 20 feet away, partially hidden under a slope of dry brush, was a boy. Older than her, maybe 10. He was face down, his body limp, not moving. Jackson bolted. Sliding down the embankment, he reached the boy and rolled him over gently. His skin was warm but clammy. There was a bruise on his temple, dried blood on his elbow, and his breathing was shallow, too shallow. His lips were pale. His shirt hung on a thin frame like he hadn't eaten properly in days. Jackson didn't hesitate. He scooped the boy into his arms and sprinted back to the truck, motioning to the girl. "Come on, let's go." "Get in." She climbed into the passenger seat without a word, still hugging the bear. Jackson laid the boy across the back seat, careful to elevate his head, and slammed the door. He jumped into the driver's seat and jammed the key into the ignition. Click. Nothing. Again. Click. No start. The engine was dead. "No. No, no, no," Jackson muttered, slamming his hand on the steering wheel. "Not now." He turned around, panic rising. The boy's breathing was shallow and slow. Time was slipping. Then the girl leaned forward, her voice as calm as a whisper in church. "Check under your feet. Sometimes the wire gets loose." Jackson froze. "What?" She pointed. "Under the pedals. Mom had the same truck once. She said if the truck won't start and there's a metal smell, it could be the red wire. It's close to the floor." He blinked, then dropped to the floorboard, his flashlight trembling in his hand. And there it was. A frayed red wire near the fuse box, the insulation eaten away. Must have come loose with the last hard stop. He grabbed the metal key ring from his pocket and quickly fashioned a temporary fix, looping the wire back into contact and holding it in place with a rubber band from the first aid kit. He climbed back into the seat, breath caught in his throat. He turned the key. Vroom. The engine roared to life like a miracle. The girl didn't cheer. She just held her bear tighter and turned toward the back seat, watching her brother. Jackson looked at her, this tiny stranger, dusty and brave, and whispered, "You just saved your brother's life." She didn't reply, but her eyes said everything. As they sped down the road, Jackson flicked on his emergency lights and tried to process what had just happened. Who were they? Where had they come from? And how long had they been waiting for someone, anyone, to stop? No answers came, only the haunting quiet of the Kansas evening and the faint sound of breathing in the back seat. He glanced at the girl. "What's your name?" he asked softly. She looked at him, her voice steady. "Lucy." "My name is Lucy." The cabin sat quiet beneath the twilight, its wooden frame catching the last golden glow of the sun. Jackson pulled the truck to a sharp stop in front of the porch, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The engine hissed as it cooled, and for a long moment none of them moved. He glanced over at Lucy. Her fingers clutched the bear in her lap, worn fur rubbed thin where the stuffing peeked through. She wasn't crying. She wasn't trembling, but there was something ancient in her silence, a kind of stillness that didn't belong in a child. Jackson turned toward the back seat. Toby hadn't regained consciousness. His chest rose and fell with uneven rhythm, but he was alive. That was enough for now. "All right," Jackson muttered, reaching over. "Let's get your brother inside." Lucy slid out of the passenger seat and followed closely as Jackson lifted Toby from the back seat. The boy's weight was light, too light. His limbs hung like empty sleeves, and Jackson felt a knot tighten in his gut. Whoever had left them out there hadn't just abandoned them. They'd done so without care for whether they lived through the night. He carried Toby inside, navigating past creaky floorboards and well-worn furniture, then laid him gently on the pull-out cot in the corner of the living room. He grabbed a throw blanket from the couch and tucked it around the boy, then crouched down beside him, checking his temperature again. Cooler now thanks to the damp cloth and the truck's air. Still weak, but no longer near the edge. Lucy stood by the door, watching everything. "Are you hungry?" Jackson asked. She nodded but didn't move. He walked to the kitchen, opened a can of soup, and poured it into a pot with one hand, while keeping an eye on the boy. As it simmered, he found 2 bowls, sliced some bread, and carried everything to the table. "Come sit," he said gently. Lucy hesitated before stepping forward. She climbed into the chair without a word and stared at the steam rising from the soup. Jackson sat across from her, his forearms resting on the table. "You did something pretty amazing today." She blinked. He tried again. "How did you know about that wire?" She took a slow sip of soup before answering. "Mama showed me. A long time ago our truck wouldn't start, and we were scared. She made me learn where everything was, in case we had to run again." Run. Again. Jackson felt the weight of that word settle like dust on old shelves. "Where were you coming from?" Lucy, her eyes dropped to her lap. He didn't press further. Not tonight. Not yet. Instead, he changed the subject. "That bear's got a name." She glanced down and patted the bear's head. "Waffles." He smiled softly. "Good name." They ate in silence. Outside, night fully settled, and the wind picked up just enough to rattle the loose shutters. Inside, the warmth from the stove and the presence of 2 strangers, now more than that, pushed back the loneliness that had long ago made its home here. A soft sound came from the hallway. Jackson turned his head sharply. His daughter. She stood barefoot, peeking around the corner. Auburn curls tangled from sleep, wide eyes blinking in the low light. She didn't speak, hadn't for years, But she watched them, watched Lucy, and Lucy smiled. "Hi," she said softly. Jackson's heart clenched. His daughter didn't move, but she didn't retreat either. She just looked. It was more than she had done in months. Lucy set her spoon down and walked slowly toward her, step by cautious step until they stood just a few feet apart. Then she did something Jackson hadn't expected. She reached into her small backpack and pulled out a notebook. She tore a blank page and gently offered it. "Want to draw with me?" His daughter hesitated, then took the paper. Jackson nearly dropped to his knees. Later that night, Jackson tucked a blanket around Toby and moved to the porch. He needed air, needed space to breathe without the pressure of being needed every second. He stared out into the dark, the stars like pinpricks in an endless sheet of velvet. He thought about that road, about how many cars must have passed those kids without stopping. What made him different? Maybe it was dumb luck. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was something else. Lucy stepped out quietly, wrapping a too big sweatshirt around her shoulders. Jackson offered her the rocker beside him. She sat without a word, looking up at the sky. "You did real good today," he said. She shrugged. "I just remembered what Mama taught me." "You remembered. You were brave. That matters." She turned to him. "Do you think my brother's gonna be okay?" He nodded slowly. "I think he's strong. Like you." She looked down, then asked in a whisper, "Why did you stop? Nobody else did." He swallowed. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I just saw something. That white cloth. And then I saw you. And you didn't drive away." "No," he said. "I couldn't." Lucy looked out into the dark again. "Mama used to say, if someone stops without knowing why, that means they're the right person." Jackson stared at her, the truth of those words sinking deep. Maybe he wasn't just the man who happened to drive by. Maybe he was the man who was meant to. The rain came softly at first, like the tapping of tiny fingers against the roof. It was just past midnight when the skies opened above the cabin. Jackson stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window, as the wind picked up, dragging leaves and old dreams across the porch, like ghosts that refused to settle. Inside, the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of the porch swing, moving slightly in the breeze. He was tired, bone tired, but something in him wouldn't let go of the night. Not yet. Behind him, a light flicked on. Jackson turned. Lucy stood in the hallway, her bear tucked under one arm, her other hand gently holding onto the fingers of his daughter. His heart stopped. The two girls, one who had just lost everything, and one who had barely opened herself to the world, now stood together, connected by something he couldn't name, but had waited years to witness. "I couldn't sleep," Lucy whispered. Jackson nodded and approached them slowly. "You want to sit outside with me? Just for a little bit." Lucy looked to his daughter, whose gaze remained fixed on the rain-dotted window. Then gently, the girl nodded. Just once. It was small. So small. But to Jackson, it felt like the world tilted back into place. He grabbed a blanket and opened the front door. The porch smelled of wet pine and old wood. The wind was cooler now, fresh with the scent of dirt and spring. He settled into the rocker and laid the blanket across his lap as the girl sat cross-legged on the floorboards, close, but not touching. No one spoke. Jackson didn't dare break the moment. He watched as Lucy pulled a piece of cardboard from the notebook she carried, a back cover slightly bent, and dug around for a pencil from her backpack. She passed it wordlessly to the girl beside her, who took it with hesitant fingers. Then together they began to draw. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fast. But it was real. Two little girls sketching under a soft rain, under the safety of a porch that hadn't seen joy in years. Jackson leaned back and exhaled slowly. Sometime later, Lucy looked up at him. "Do you have tape?" He blinked, then stood. Yeah, I think so. Why can I hang this? He found a roll of clear tape in the kitchen drawer and returned it to her. She stood, walked to the beam beside the front door, and carefully, reverently taped her drawing to the wood. Jackson stepped closer and squinted at the pencil lines. It wasn't a perfect rendering, just the outlines of a truck, a little girl waving something white, and a man standing in the middle of the road. But at the bottom, in all capital letters, she had written, "We're safe now." He swallowed hard. "Did your mama teach you to draw like that?" he asked softly. "No," Lucy said. "I just started one day, when I was scared." He knelt down beside her, glancing again at the drawing. "You were scared today, weren't you?" She nodded. "And you still remembered how to fix a truck. That's brave, Lucy." She looked at him, then really looked with eyes that held stories no child should have to carry. Mama said, "Being brave isn't not being scared. It's doing what you have to do, even when you are." Jackson smiled gently, something cracking open inside him. She was right. As the rain eased, he led them back inside. The girls settled onto the pull-out cot together, Lucy's arm instinctively curled around his daughter's shoulders, who didn't move away. He pulled the blanket over them and kissed his daughter's forehead. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch. In the kitchen, Jackson sat at the table and opened his worn notebook, the one he used when he had thoughts too heavy to carry. He stared at the blank page, the words forming in his mind, before he could stop them. "Tonight I saw something I didn't know I was missing. 2 children strangers taught my daughter how to sit still with someone else. And they taught me that maybe love isn't something you protect. Maybe it's something you share and risk, even when it hurts." He closed the notebook and stared into the dark. The next morning, Jackson rose early. Toby was awake. Barely. The boy's eyelids fluttered when Jackson approached the cot, and he groaned softly. Jackson knelt beside him, placing a firm but gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Hey there, big guy. You're safe. Just rest. You're at my place." Toby blinked, once tried to speak and failed. Jackson offered a sip of water. The boy drank, then turned his head toward the noise in the kitchen, 2 girls laughing softly over something Lucy had said. The sound lit a faint spark behind his tired eyes. "Your sister's been watching over you," Jackson said. "She's pretty incredible." Toby gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then, with a rasping voice that startled Jackson, the boy whispered, "She always is." Jackson exhaled. His throat tightened. "You're welcome to stay," he said. "As long as you need." Toby didn't respond, but he didn't resist either. And that was enough for now. That afternoon, Jackson walked past the drawing, still taped to the beam by the door. The words stared back at him, simple and absolute. "We're safe now." He touched the edge of the paper lightly, almost afraid to wrinkle it. Somewhere deep inside, he knew safety wasn't about locked doors or alarm systems. It was about what Lucy had brought with her. Hope. And somehow, that was more than enough. By the end of the first week, it became clear to Jackson that Lucy was unlike any child he had ever known. It wasn't just her calm demeanor or the way she comforted his daughter with wordless presence. It was how she seemed to notice everything, where the mismatched mugs went in the cupboard, which drawer held the flashlight, the precise creak in the second stair, and the fact that Jackson always paused before opening the fridge, as if double-checking that he had remembered to buy milk. She didn't ask questions the way most children did. She observed. She absorbed. She filed away detail after detail with the quiet precision of someone who had learned far too early that survival often depended on noticing what others overlooked. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently on the windows and a pot of chili simmered on the stove, Jackson watched Lucy sitting cross-legged on the living room rug. She was drawing again this time, on the back of an old cereal box. His daughter sat nearby, copying shapes with a crayon. Toby, still pale, but gaining strength, rested on the couch with a book open on his chest. "What are you working on?" Jackson asked, walking over. Lucy looked up. A map. A treasure map. She shook her head. A memory map. Jackson crouched down to look. The drawing was intricate, more precise than anything a 6-year-old should be capable of. She'd sketched the interior of a house, a wide staircase, 2 chandeliers, a fireplace flanked by tall windows, a sunroom with potted plants. He recognized none of it. "What is this place?" he asked gently. Lucy paused. Her pencil hovered over the page. "It's my grandma's house," she said finally. "The one where we used to live, before we had to leave." Jackson studied the drawing again. There was something deeply personal in the lines, a child's effort to preserve something precious before it faded completely. He felt a sting behind his eyes. "Can you tell me why you had to leave?" Lucy didn't look up. They didn't like Mama. "Why?" She shrugged, but her voice was steady. "They said she didn't belong. Said she ruined everything. But she didn't. She just wanted to keep us safe." Jackson sat down beside her. "What were their names?" She looked at him, suddenly wary. He held up a hand. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." She hesitated, then whispered. "Maybridge. That was the name on the mailbox. Mama said never to say it out loud if we left. But she didn't say not to remember it." Jackson's chest tightened. Maybridge. He had heard that name before in newspapers whispered in local coffee shops. One of those families with money, old enough to own half the town, and secrets deeper than a well. He kept his face neutral. "You're really good at remembering, Lucy." She nodded. "Mama said I had a gift. But sometimes it's not a gift. Sometimes it's like carrying too many boxes." Jackson smiled softly. "Even if the boxes are heavy, they make you stronger." She looked at him, then leaned her head lightly against his arm. It was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily, and he felt something settle inside him, something he hadn't realized had been restless for years. That evening, Jackson pulled out his old laptop and started researching. Not to dig into Lucy's past, he wasn't ready for that, but to try to understand who might be looking for her, if anyone was. He found the name Emily Maybridge in several society pages, charity galas, board meetings, corporate partnerships. But then 5 years ago her name vanished. One article mentioned her sudden withdrawal from public life. No scandal. No explanation. Just gone. There was a photo. Jackson stared at it for a long time. The woman was elegant but unpretentious, with kind eyes, and auburn hair swept back in a loose twist. Lucy had her eyes. Toby had her jawline. But it wasn't the resemblance that hit him hardest. It was the way she stood in the picture, slightly angled, almost protective of the 2 children beside her. One hand on each of their backs, like she already knew she was their shield and might have to run someday. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. Who leaves behind a life of wealth and influence to protect their children unless the danger is real? And how much had she sacrificed just to keep them free? Later that night, as Jackson sat on the porch with a mug of tea, Lucy stepped outside again. She had taken to joining him each evening, always wrapped in the same old blanket. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything. Why do you keep looking at the stars?" He smiled into his cup. "Habit, I guess. My wife used to say they reminded her there was more out there than our problems. Where is she now?" Jackson hesitated. "She passed away a few years ago." Lucy nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry." He looked over at her. "You've been through a lot, too." She stared out at the night. Mama used to look at the stars, too. She said, if anything ever happened, I could still talk to her that way, like the sky was a telephone. Jackson chuckled softly, though his throat tightened. That's beautiful. She said good people don't disappear. They just change places. Jackson didn't reply. He just stared upward, with her letting the silence stretch between them, not empty, but shared. Sacred. And somewhere above them, the sky shimmered with quiet stars. It started with a name. Jackson couldn't sleep. The weight of Lucy's words Maybridge echoed in his head long after the house had gone quiet. He'd tucked the children in, cleaned the kitchen, and sat on the porch until the stars blurred into the night sky. But nothing quieted the thought that he was now part of something far bigger than a single act of kindness on a roadside. Back inside, he retrieved the tattered backpack Lucy had arrived with. He wasn't one to pry, but tonight felt different, necessary. He unzipped the front pouch and found only a few small items: a broken crayon, a dried lavender sachet, and a folded piece of paper yellowed at the edges. It was a page torn from a legal pad. Written in elegant slanted handwriting were just 5 words and a number: Rachel Green. 785-555-50193. He stared at it, the name familiar. Then it hit him. Rachel Green, one of the few female partners in a high-profile law firm in Topeka. Her name had surfaced years ago during a landmark child advocacy case. She had a reputation for fighting tooth and nail for children in impossible situations. Smart, relentless, unshakably moral, and now apparently connected to Lucy's mother. Jackson hesitated for a long time, fingers hovering over the rotary dial on the cabin wall. Calling meant crossing a line one between protection and exposure. But if Rachel Green was someone Emily Maybridge trusted, then maybe it was time. He picked up the receiver and dialed. It rang 4 times. Green. A calm voice answered, clipped and professional. Jackson cleared his throat. Ms. Green, I'm sorry to call so late. My name's Jackson Ford. I found your number in the belongings of a little girl named Lucy. I believe she's your client's daughter. There was a pause, sharp, loaded. Where is she? Rachel's voice shifted instantly, not panicked, but urgent. Is she safe? She's safe. She and her brother are staying with me. I found them by the side of a county road near Winfield. The boy was unconscious. I brought them home. They've been with me for 5 days. Another pause, but this one was heavier, like someone had taken a deep breath and was holding it. You said your name is Jackson Ford, she asked. Yes, ma'am. You wouldn't by any chance have been driving an old red Ford pickup that night, would you? He blinked. Yes. Her voice broke slightly. Then, you're the one Emily hoped would find them. The next morning, Rachel Green arrived. Jackson had expected someone cold and corporate, perhaps in heels and a pantsuit. But the woman who stepped out of the black SUV was practical jeans, a windbreaker, sensible boots, with eyes that had seen too much and didn't flinch. He met her on the porch. They're inside, he said, gesturing behind him. Sleeping, I think. Toby's still recovering. Rachel nodded but didn't move forward yet. She looked at him long and hard. She chose you, she said. Jackson frowned. Emily. She had no way of knowing who it would be, but she believed that if something ever happened to her, the world would send the right person. She told me, someone will stop. Someone always stops. That's who I want my kids with. Jackson exhaled. That's a lot to live up to. Rachel smiled gently. You already are. They sat on the porch, and Rachel pulled a manila folder from her bag. She opened it carefully. Emily Maybridge came to me 5 years ago, terrified. She had uncovered financial abuse within her husband's family, laundering money, bribing local officials, using the children's trust funds for personal gain. When she confronted them, they threatened to declare her mentally unfit and take the kids. So she vanished, She ran, Jackson asked. She disappeared without a trace. Changed names, moved towns every few months, homeschooled the kids. She worked night shifts and cleaned motel rooms. And every time she found a moment of stability, she sent me a letter, handwritten, never digital. Rachel pulled out one such letter and handed it to Jackson. The paper was thin, the ink smudged in places, but the writing was unmistakably full of strength. If something happens to me, and I believe one day it will, please don't search by blood or last name. Search by heart. Someone will stop. Someone who doesn't have to. Someone who chooses to. That's where they'll be safe. Jackson read the lines 3 times before lowering the page to his lap. Why didn't she go to the police? She tried. But the Maybridge name opens doors and closes others. She was alone in a system stacked against her. That's why she gave me custody papers. They're unsigned but notarized. She trusted me, and now apparently she trusted you. Rachel looked out over the land surrounding the cabin, quiet, untamed, and safe. This is a good place, she said. They've never had a home that felt like this. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost in a whisper, he asked, "What happens now?" Rachel turned to him. "That depends on you." Inside, Lucy had been listening. She stood just behind the screen door, bare feet on the hardwood fingers clutched around Waffles' paw. Toby sat nearby, reading but watching her with alert eyes. "You okay?" he asked. Lucy didn't answer at first. Then she whispered, "She's here." "Rachel." Toby nodded slowly. "Do you trust her?" Lucy's eyes never left the door. "I think Mama did." Then, after a moment, "And he does too." Toby followed her gaze to Jackson's silhouette on the porch. He let out a breath and leaned back. "Then maybe we can stay a little longer." Jackson hadn't opened the envelope for hours. After Rachel left that afternoon, promising to return the next day with legal documents and more background on the Maybridge family's pursuit of the children, he sat on the porch for nearly 2 hours, the sealed envelope balanced on his lap. Inside, she'd said, was a letter from Emily. A real one. Not a second-hand story. Not a vague court document or a paraphrased quote. A letter written by the woman who'd trusted him without ever knowing his name. Search by heart, Rachel had told him. That's what she said. Jackson wasn't used to being the man someone trusted without reason. He was the man people counted on in practical ways to fix their breaks, to show up when their well froze, to keep his head down and his word intact. But this felt heavier than any engine block. When the porch light clicked on automatically with the first hint of dusk, Jackson finally broke the seal. The letter was handwritten on thick ivory paper creased down the center. The handwriting was beautiful, fluid, but there were moments in the spacing, in the slight tilt, where he could tell her hand had been shaking. He began to read. "If you're reading this, then something I prayed would never happen has. I don't know who you are. I don't know what led you to find my children. But I believe deeply that you're the person who saw what others didn't, that you stopped, that you chose them. I have lived with fear for so long that sometimes I forgot what peace feels like. But Lucy reminded me. And Toby, he carried more weight than he ever should have, just to protect his sister. You'll see that soon. He's quiet, but he watches everything. And Lucy, oh, she remembers everything. She remembers the sound of my laugh before I got sick. She remembers how to fix the truck when it sputters. She remembers how to recognize danger, but more importantly, she remembers how to spot kindness. She's better at it than I ever was. I couldn't keep running, not with the illness getting worse and the shadows getting closer. So I did what I could. I trained them in every small way I knew how. And I gave their names to Rachel because she is the only person in this world I trust, without question. But I also asked her to wait, to hold this letter and everything else until they were found by someone who wasn't just convenient or wealthy or powerful, but someone good. If that's you, thank you. You've already done more than most people would. There's no inheritance. I can leave no estate that matters. Just them. They are everything good I ever had. Please give them safety. Give them space to breathe. And if you have any love left to give them that too. You don't have to be perfect. Just don't leave. Emily Maybridge. By the time Jackson finished reading, the light had deepened into full night. The porch bulb buzzed softly, and the hum of crickets pressed gently against the windows. He folded the letter with reverence, as if closing the cover of a sacred book. Then he slipped it back into the envelope and set it down beside him. For a long time he simply sat there, letting the words settle into his chest, like rain into dry soil. Inside the house, the laughter of children trickled through the thin cabin walls. It was Lucy's laugh, clear and light, followed by a surprised giggle from his daughter. She'd laughed. Really laughed. That sound had been gone from his home for nearly 3 years. And now it was here again. He rose to his feet, walked inside, and stood in the doorway of the living room. The 3 children were gathered around a stack of picture books sprawled across the rug. Lucy had her bear tucked under her arm, and Toby leaned against the couch, visibly stronger than he had been even 2 days before. Jackson's daughter was coloring, but her body language was different now, less guarded, more present. He didn't say anything, just watched. Then Lucy looked up and smiled at him. "You read it?" she asked. Jackson blinked. "What?" "The letter," she said. "You were holding it when you sat down." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I read it." Lucy stood and walked over to him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and folded a drawing lined in crayon. She placed it in his hand. It was a picture of him drawn simply, but with unmistakable detail. He was standing in the middle of a road, one hand outstretched, and 2 children behind him. Overhead, a white cloth fluttered like a flag of surrender or salvation. At the bottom, in blocky letters, she had written, "You stopped. So we could stay." His throat tightened. "You drew this." She nodded. "Why, because Mama said the person who stopped wouldn't be just someone we passed. They'd be the reason we stayed." Jackson crouched and looked her in the eye. "Lucy, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what kind of trouble your family might still bring. But I do know this, you and Toby and your mama. You deserved better. And I'm not going anywhere." She leaned in and hugged him. It wasn't tight. It wasn't rushed. It was just steady. The way trust is born when someone finally keeps their word. Later that night, Jackson stood in the hallway outside the kids' rooms. The cabin was still. The stars outside blinked through the window panes. He thought of Emily, of a woman who ran not to save herself, but to buy her children a few more breaths of peace. A woman who trained them not just in survival, but in faith that somewhere in the chaos of the world, a single moment of goodness could change everything. And now somehow, he'd become that moment. Not because he was brave, not because he was perfect, but because he stopped. And sometimes in a broken world, that's where miracles begin. The first true morning of spring arrived without announcement. No thunderous storms, no dramatic sunrise, just a gentle warmth in the air and the scent of damp earth rising from the ground. It was the kind of morning where windows begged to be opened and coffee begged to be shared on a quiet porch. Jackson woke early like always, but this time the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't empty. It wasn't hollow. It felt alive. As he stepped into the kitchen, he found Toby already at the table, slowly spreading peanut butter onto a slice of toast. The boy looked up, offered a slight nod, their version of good morning, and returned to his task. His bruises were fading. The color was coming back to his face. But more than that, something deeper was changing something behind his eyes. Less guarded, less gray. "You sleep all right?" Jackson asked, reaching for the coffee tin. Toby shrugged. "Better than before." "I'll take it," Jackson said with a grin. He poured 2 mugs and slid one across the table. Toby stared at it uncertain. "Half coffee, half milk," Jackson assured. "You're practically a grown man now." Toby took the mug and lifted it with both hands. One small sip, then another. Then the faintest smirk. Lucy appeared a few minutes later barefoot and already humming. Jackson's daughter followed close behind, carrying a small bowl of dry cereal and a folded blanket. She placed the bowl on the table, climbed into her usual seat next to Lucy, and tucked the blanket neatly across her lap, a routine that had emerged like clockwork over the past few days. No one said much, but they didn't have to. Something sacred had rooted itself in the ordinary. Later that morning, Jackson found Toby in the backyard, examining the old chicken coop that hadn't housed a hen in years. The boy walked the perimeter, tapped the frame with a stick, and crouched beside the latch. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Jackson called from the porch. Toby looked up. "It's leaning, but not broken." Jackson descended the steps and walked over. "Yeah, I've been meaning to fix it for, well, longer than I care to admit." Toby ran a hand along the edge of the frame. "We could brace it here," he said, pointing. "If we anchor the back post deeper, it'll hold." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "You know about this stuff," Toby shrugged. "Mama taught me. Before we left the last place, we built a rabbit hutch out of a broken dresser. She said fixing things teaches you how to stay steady." Jackson chuckled. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." Toby smiled, a real one this time, and said nothing more. Together, they spent the next hour gathering tools, digging out rotted wood, and replacing panels. It wasn't perfect work, but it was honest. By midday, the coop stood straight again, with a new hinge, fashioned from scrap metal, and a fresh coat of weatherproof paint. Lucy insisted on applying herself. "I want the chickens to feel welcome," she explained, tongue poking out the side of her mouth as she painted. "Didn't know chickens had interior design preferences," Jackson teased. "They do," she said solemnly. "Warm colors help with egg laying." He didn't question it. That evening, Jackson made spaghetti Lucy's request, and they all sat together at the dinner table for the first time. Not couches, not corners. A real table. A real meal. He passed around garlic bread and poured water into mismatched glasses. At one point, Jackson caught his daughter watching him. She didn't look away. She smiled, and then, as natural as breathing, she whispered, "Thank you." He froze. Toby's fork paused midair. Lucy went still. Jackson set down his cup slowly. "What did you say, sweetheart?" His daughter lowered her head shyly. "Thank you." It was the first word she had spoken in nearly 3 years. Tears threatened to betray him right there at the table, but he blinked them back. Not yet. Let the moment breathe. Let it land. He reached across and placed a hand gently over hers. "You're welcome," he whispered. Lucy leaned over and hugged her tightly. Toby looked away, blinking fast, and for the first time since Emily's letter, Jackson allowed himself to believe this wasn't just a temporary refuge. This was becoming something else. This was becoming a home. After dinner, Jackson cleaned the dishes while the kids drew comics in the living room. The light from the kitchen spilled across the floorboards, and from time to time, he heard them giggling real unguarded laughter that filled the spaces long left hollow. When the dishes were done, he stepped outside with a cup of tea and sat on the porch swing. The stars were coming out again, slow and steady. It was the same sky, same trees, same wind. But nothing about his life was the same anymore. Rachel was due back the next day with the official custody paperwork. They would have to discuss legal guardianship court filings, protection orders. Real things, complicated things. But tonight was simple. Tonight was full. He felt a presence beside him and looked over. Toby stood in the doorway, hands in his hoodie pocket. "Thanks for today," the boy said quietly. Jackson nodded. "You did good work. I think she'd be proud." Jackson didn't ask who he meant. He knew. "She already is," he said. Toby nodded, once turned back inside and left Jackson with the stars. For a man who'd thought his story had already been told. Loss, quiet survival, the quiet ache of unfinished love. Jackson was beginning to understand something different. Sometimes the greatest stories don't start when something ends. They start when someone decides to stay. The fireplace crackled softly, sending flickers of amber light across the walls of the cabin. Outside, the wind howled low, brushing against the windows, like it was asking to be let in. But inside, all was warm, the kind of warmth that lives not just in wood and fire, but in people who've chosen to stay. Jackson sat on the braided rug back against the couch, one arm resting on his bent knee, his gaze fixed on the flames. Across from him, Rachel Green sat with a mug of chamomile tea in hand, her expression relaxed in a way he hadn't seen before. She had arrived just before dinner, her SUV pulling up with a fresh stack of legal documents and a look that said she hadn't slept much, but she still smiled when she saw the kids playing in the yard. Now, after the kids had gone to bed and the dishes were done, they sat together in a rare pocket of stillness. "I used to hate quiet," she said, swirling her tea. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Yeah." She nodded. "When I first started in law, I lived downtown right above a bar. Noise was my anchor. Silence felt like something was missing." And now she leaned back slightly. "Now I think silence is just truth without disguise." Jackson smiled faintly. "That's poetic for a lawyer." Rachel chuckled. "Don't tell my clients." They fell into a comfortable quiet, each watching the flames twist and settle in the hearth. Shadows danced along the floorboards, soft and shifting. "I've never had a case like this," she said after a moment. Jackson didn't reply, but she went on. "I've handled custody disputes, emergency removals, abuse survivors. But this Emily's plan, her faith in the unknown. It's the kind of thing that either restores your faith in people or makes you question everything you thought you knew." Jackson's voice was low. "So, which one is it? For you?" She turned to look at him and her eyes held something new. Something not just professional, but deeply personal. "I think it's both," she said. "But mostly, it's restoring something I didn't realize I'd lost." Their eyes met, and in the soft firelight, the air between them shifted, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. A different kind of heat. A different kind of trust. Jackson looked away first, not out of discomfort, but out of reverence. Rachel set her mug down on the table. "The custody papers are ready. You'll be listed as legal guardian. I'll remain secondary executor just to keep things clean." He nodded. "Thank you." Technically, she added, "You're not doing this alone anymore. I've added myself as co-counsel to the case, so if the Maybridges try to challenge this, and they will, they'll have to come through me." Jackson looked at her, and for the first time allowed himself to ask something that had been pressing on him for days. "Why are you doing this?" Rachel tilted her head. "Because it's right. I know that. But..." He hesitated. "There are other lawyers. Safer cases. Simpler ones. Why stay in this?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, hands folded. "My little sister," she said softly. She was caught in something like this. Different people, different city, but the same kind of cruelty masked by wealth and influence. I was still in law school when it happened. Couldn't do a damn thing. She didn't make it out. Jackson's heart sank. Rachel. She held up a hand. It's all right. It's been a long time. But I swore I'd spend my life making sure no other kid gets erased just because someone rich says they don't matter. He nodded silent. So when Emily came to me, she continued. Scared, determined. Smarter than anyone gave her credit for. I saw my sister in her. I saw what bravery looked like with a broken heart, and I promised her I'd be the one to see it through. They sat with that for a moment. Not in grief, but in understanding. I'm sorry you had to carry that alone, Jackson said. Rachel looked at him again, and this time her gaze was unguarded. I'm not carrying it alone anymore. That sentence, so simple, so gently offered, landed in Jackson's chest like a key in a long locked door. Outside, the wind had calmed. The fire dipped low, but still glowed steady. And in that quiet moment, two people who had spent most of their lives bracing for impact finally let their shoulders drop. Later that night, as Jackson checked the kids' room, he found Lucy and his daughter curled together under one blanket arms, tangled a half-finished drawing between them. Waffles, the bear, sat perched on the windowsill like a sleepy guardian. Toby was still awake, reading by flashlight. Can't sleep? Jackson asked from the doorway. Toby shook his head. Not used to peace, I guess. Jackson stepped in and ruffled his hair. It grows on you. Toby smirked. That what happened to you? Something like that, Jackson said, then paused. You did good work on the coupe today. Thanks. I was thinking maybe we could add a ramp tomorrow. I like the sound of that. As Jackson turned to leave, Toby called out, You know, you don't talk much about your wife. Jackson paused. No, he said softly. I guess I don't. Toby didn't press, but something about the way he looked at Jackson like he understood loss too well for his age made Jackson say, She was kind, strong, the kind of person who made silence feel safe. Toby nodded. That's what this place feels like. Jackson turned off the flashlight. Then we're doing something right. Back in the living room, the fire had gone to embers. Rachel had fallen asleep on the couch, arms folded, head resting against the cushions. A blanket covered her shoulders. He didn't remember putting it there. Jackson stood for a long moment, watching the soft rise and fall of her breathing. The cabin, once filled with ghosts and silence, was now brimming with the slow, powerful breath of new life. A man, a woman, 3 children, all marked by loss, all learning how to stay. And maybe something like love was beginning to grow in the quiet between the flames. The wind changed the morning the Maybridges came. It wasn't a dramatic storm or a thunderous warning, just a subtle shift in the air, the kind of shift you feel in your skin before you register it in your mind. It rattled the wind chimes, gently made the porch swing creak, and unsettled the leaves along the dirt path leading to Jackson's cabin. Jackson had just poured coffee when he saw the black luxury SUV crunch into view at the far end of the drive. It didn't belong. It gleamed too sharply under the Kansas sun, its tinted windows hiding intentions as cold as its engine. He set the mug down slowly. Rachel stepped onto the porch seconds later, as if she'd known it was coming. Her jacket was already on. Legal folder in hand. They're early, she said. Who are they? She looked him in the eye. The Maybridges, or rather their lawyers. The family won't show. They don't do confrontation unless it's in a courtroom or through a screen of money. Jackson nodded, jaw tightening. He'd known this would come eventually. A family that powerful, that entitled they didn't give up bloodlines or inheritance without a fight. And Lucy and Toby weren't just orphans. They were keys to a name, to legacy, to financial control. The door of the SUV opened, and a man stepped out, lean-suited, polished. Next to him, a younger woman in sharp heels carrying a briefcase. Jackson didn't miss the way her eyes swept the house, judging it like a failed property listing. Rachel stepped off the porch and met them halfway. "I'm Rachel Green," she said calmly, presenting her ID. "Legal counsel for the minors." The man glanced at the ID unimpressed. "Daniel Cutler. Representing the Maybridge estate. I figured," she said. "You're 3 days early. Care to explain why you're here without court approval?" He smiled, thin and condescending. "We hope to avoid court altogether. If you're willing to cooperate, of course." Jackson stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed. "You can speak plainly," Rachel said. "You're here to take them." Cutler nodded once. "The estate would like to assume temporary guardianship until a formal hearing." "It's a matter of stability, and they're stable here," Jackson interrupted. The younger woman glanced at her tablet. "Mr. Ford, with all due respect, you're a mechanic with a small cabin and no formal ties to the family. You're not equipped for, I'm equipped for kindness," he said evenly. "And they've had enough of people who weren't." Cutler shifted. "This isn't about feelings. This is about legal custody. These children are heirs to a substantial trust. We can't allow them to be influenced by someone without standing." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And I assume the estate has prepared care plans, guardianship, interviews, home studies. Or are you simply offering them back into the hands of the same people who drove their mother into hiding?" Silence. "Thought so," she said. "You're not here for their well-being. You're here to reclaim assets." Cutler's voice darkened. "That girl isn't even old enough to decide which cereal she wants in the morning. Do you really think her opinion is relevant?" Behind them, the screen door creaked open. Lucy stood barefoot in the doorway, hair tousled. Waffles clutched tightly to her chest. She looked small, impossibly small, against the men in suits and the looming vehicle. But her voice was clear. "I want to stay." Everyone turned. Rachel stepped toward her. "Lucy, sweetheart, I want to stay," she repeated louder this time. Her chin lifted. "This is where we're safe. Mama said if someone stops for you without knowing why, that's the person you trust." He stopped. Toby appeared beside her now, one hand gently on her shoulder. "He fixed everything that was broken," the boy said simply. Jackson didn't move. His throat tightened, but he let the children speak. Lucy stepped forward onto the porch, her eyes locked on the lawyers like she was 10 feet tall. "I don't want a big house. I don't want money. I want pancakes on Sunday and chickens in the backyard. I want a porch swing that squeaks when it rains and people who don't leave when it gets hard." Rachel turned slowly, eyes shining. Cutler cleared his throat. "The court will have to decide." "They will," Rachel cut in her voice, suddenly razor sharp. "And I'll be there when they do. With testimony. With written statements. With a psychologist's report showing the emotional stability these children have developed under Mr. Ford's care. And if the court listens to even a fraction of what these kids just said, you'll lose." Cutler's jaw tightened. "You'll regret drawing this out." "I don't regret doing what's right," she said coldly. "And neither do they." The lawyers retreated with quiet fury, the SUV disappearing down the drive without further word. The wind died as the tires vanished into the distance. Jackson turned to the kids who stood side by side on the porch. "You two all right?" Toby nodded. Lucy's shoulders slumped a little, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stepped forward and took Jackson's hand. "They tried to make it sound like we were lucky to belong to them," she said softly. "But I think we're lucky because we don't." Jackson crouched, pulled both kids into his arms, and let the porch wrap them in silence. Behind them, Rachel leaned on the railing, her voice low. "She's going to change the world." "She already changed mine," Jackson said. That night, Jackson stood outside alone for a moment. The stars were back again, quiet and steady above the roof. He thought about what Lucy had said. Not just the words, but the conviction behind them. She wasn't just smart. She was brave. The kind of brave that reshaped rooms, that stopped grown men cold. That told the truth when the world said to sit still. Rachel came up beside him, 2 mugs in hand. She handed him one and leaned into his shoulder just enough to let him know she wasn't going anywhere. "They'll try again," she said. "I know. We'll be ready." He looked at her then and finally let himself say what he'd been holding since the firelight. "I don't want this to end after the court hearings, after the documents, after they're safe." She met his gaze. "Then don't let it." The porch light had been flickering for years. Sometimes Jackson thought it stayed on out of pure stubbornness, like the house itself, weathered, but standing. He had meant to replace it 100 times, but never quite brought himself to do it. Not because it was difficult, but because in some quiet part of him, the flickering had become a kind of ritual, a symbol. He hadn't realized until now how much it meant that it never fully went out. That evening, with the court hearing scheduled for the following week and the tension of the Maybridge visit still trailing them like smoke, Jackson stood beneath that same light and watched as the cabin behind him glowed with life. Toby sat at the kitchen table polishing the last of the wooden slats they had sanded earlier for the chicken coop ramp. He worked with care tongue, peeking slightly from the corner of his mouth, the way boys do when they're trying to get something just right. Lucy and Jackson's daughter were nestled in a corner of the living room, heads together over a new notebook, their pencils scribbling quietly, as if writing secret messages to the stars. They had started creating a comic book together, The Bear and the Girl Who Knew Everything. Lucy wrote, Jackson's daughter illustrated. Waffles was the main character, of course. Rachel was in the hallway, her voice low and patient as she spoke on the phone with a children's counselor she'd arranged for Toby. Not because he was in trouble, but because she believed he deserved to tell his story to someone who could help him make peace with it. Jackson watched them all, then leaned on the railing and looked out into the trees. Fireflies danced just above the grass. A frog croaked somewhere near the fence. For the first time in years, he wasn't listening for danger. He was listening for quiet. Not emptiness, peace. Rachel joined him a few minutes later, stepping outside with 2 mugs of hot cider. The breeze tugged at her sweater, and her hair had come loose from its bun. She handed him a mug. "Kids are settled." Jackson murmured. "It's hard to believe this place was silent just a month ago." Rachel sipped her cider. "It doesn't feel like they're just visiting anymore." "They're not." He turned to her fully, his voice lower now. "This house has seen a lot. Grief, loneliness, me trying to raise a child who wouldn't let me hold her hand, and me not knowing how to keep holding on. But now, it feels like everything in this place finally makes sense." Rachel tilted her head. "Because of them, because of what they brought with them," he said. "A second chance I didn't know I needed." She looked at him, something quiet unfolding in her gaze. I think Emily knew that she said softly, that whoever stopped really stopped wouldn't just save her children, they'd be saved too. Jackson's throat tightened. He looked away, then reached up and tapped the base of the porch light above them. This light, he said, used to flicker every night, like it couldn't decide whether to stay on. I never fixed it. But lately, Rachel looked up. It hasn't flickered once. Later that night, just before bed, Jackson tucked his daughter in and kissed her forehead. She reached up without being asked and gently touched his cheek. "I drew something for you," she whispered. He smiled. "Yeah," she pointed to the nightstand. He picked up the drawing. It was simple in colored pencil, their house drawn in childlike angles, with a porch that seemed to glow from the center, and above it, scribbled in soft, purple letters, "This is where Daddy smiles again." Jackson sat down at the edge of her bed, his hand still holding the drawing. "I do smile more now," he said quietly. She looked at him. Because of Lucy and Toby, because of you. Because you came back to me. And because they reminded us both how to keep going." She nodded, sleepy but content, and turned to her side, hugging the stuffed cat he had bought her 2 birthdays ago, but which had remained untouched until Lucy arrived. He stood there a moment longer, just watching her breathe, then turned off the light. In the living room, Rachel sat with Toby, and Lucy, reviewing what the court process might look like in gentle words, with all the intensity replaced by reassurance. "You don't have to speak if you don't want to," she said. "But if you do, the judge will listen." "What if they try to take us again?" Lucy asked, her voice small but clear. "They won't," Rachel said. "Not this time. Not with the truth on our side." Toby leaned forward. "Do we get to say what we want?" "You do," Rachel said. "Your voices matter, especially now." The boy nodded, a quiet strength in his shoulders. After the kids went to bed, Rachel found Jackson again, this time, in the den, holding Emily's letter in one hand and Lucy's comic draft in the other. He looked up when she entered. They both told the same story, he said. One with words, the other with drawings. Rachel stepped closer. "What story is that?" "That love doesn't always look the way people expect. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it's found on the side of the road, or in an old chicken coop, or in a kid who remembers everything." He looked at her fully now. "And sometimes it's in someone who shows up and never walks away." She sat beside him and reached for his hand. "I'm not walking away." He nodded. "I know." That night, long after the cabin had gone still, the porch light continued to glow, not flickering, not faltering, just on. Like it had found its reason. Like it had finally decided that this was the place it belonged. Like everyone else in that little home, the courtroom was smaller than Jackson expected. No marble pillars, no sweeping ceilings, just wood-paneled walls, a soft hum from the overhead lights, and a judge who looked more like a retired teacher than a dispenser of life-altering decisions. It felt less like a battle arena and more like a waiting room for truth. Rachel sat beside him at the long table, crisp in a navy suit, her voice, steady eyes sharper than ever. Across the aisle sat the Maybridge representatives, polished, perfumed, and brittle behind their smiles. Lucy and Toby sat quietly behind Jackson, Lucy holding waffles in her lap. Toby sitting tall, his hand resting protectively on his sister's shoulder. Jackson's daughter was there too, curled against Rachel's assistant, a colored pencil in hand, drawing something no one could see yet. When the judge called the session to order, Jackson felt his pulse slow, not because he wasn't afraid, but because for the first time in years, fear no longer dictated his next move. The proceedings began predictably. The Maybridge attorneys spoke of stability of educational resources, of returning the children to their rightful place. They referenced the family's estate, its legacy, its responsibility to shape the next generation. The words were carefully chosen, sterile rehearsed, devoid of heart. Then Rachel rose. She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She simply told the story. She spoke of Emily not as a runaway heiress, but as a mother who had given up everything to protect her children from manipulation and control. She spoke of the bruises Toby had arrived with, the silence Lucy had held like a fortress, the trembling in Jackson's daughter that had been replaced slowly with smiles and sentences. She placed Lucy's comic book on the judge's bench. She read from Emily's handwritten letter. She let silence fall in just the right places. Then she sat down and whispered to Jackson. "We've said what matters." The judge asked if the children wanted to speak. Jackson turned, expecting hesitation. But Lucy stood. She walked to the center of the room, tiny in the vast space, and looked directly at the judge. "I know I'm just a kid," she began, "but I remember everything." The courtroom stilled. I remember the big house, and the locked doors, and the way people looked at Mama like she didn't belong even when she tried her best. She clutched Waffles closer. I remember how scared she was when she got sick, but she still packed our bags at night just in case. She told me, if something happens to me, someone will stop. Someone good. Lucy looked at Jackson. He did. Then she looked at the judge again. This isn't just a house. It's the first place I ever saw someone fix something and not ask for anything in return. The first place my brother slept through the night. The first place I ever heard my best friend laugh. She paused. I don't want to go back to where people see me as something they can own. I want to stay where I'm loved. She stepped back and sat down. The courtroom was quiet, not from shock, but from something deeper reverence. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was soft. I've presided over family court for nearly 30 years. I've seen wealth distort love, and I've seen poverty deepen it. But what I've heard today is clarity. He looked down at the paper in front of him, then back up at the Maybridge attorneys. This court rules in favor of permanent guardianship granted to Mr. Jackson Ford, with full legal custody of Lucy Maybridge and Tobias Maybridge, effective immediately. The gavel fell. Rachel let out a long, slow breath. Jackson didn't move, not at first. He was still trying to understand that the war was over, that they had won, not with power, but with truth. Lucy launched herself into his arms, Waffles and all. Toby stood and gave Rachel the smallest, proudest nod of his life. Jackson's daughter, watching from the corner, lifted her newest drawing, a picture of their porch light, glowing warm beneath the words, "This is where the road ends and home begins." That night, back at the cabin, Jackson built a fire in the backyard pit. Not for warmth, but for celebration. The kids roasted marshmallows. Rachel poured cider into mason jars. They lit sparklers Toby had found in the garage, and for a while the yard glowed like it was the 4th of July. At some point, Lucy tugged on Jackson's sleeve and whispered, "Can we go back to the place?" He knew what she meant. So they got in the truck, just the two of them, and drove out to the stretch of road where it all began. The sun was low when they arrived. Orange. Soft. Lucy stepped out, walked to the patch of grass by the ditch, and stood in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just knelt down and placed something small in the grass, a folded white cloth. Jackson joined her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to leave anything behind," he said gently. She looked up at him, smiling. "I'm not," she said. "I'm just saying thank you." They stood together side by side as the wind picked up and carried the cloth a few inches before it settled gently against the earth. On the drive back, Lucy looked out the window, quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Do you think Mama knows Jackson kept his eyes on the road? I think she knew the day she wrote that letter." Lucy nodded. "She said good people don't disappear," she whispered. "They just change places." He reached across the seat and squeezed her hand. "Well," he said softly, "I think she's right here." The cabin came into view, warm with porch light. Laughter floated from the backyard. A home built not by blood, but by choice, by kindness, by the decision to stop and stay. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Whether you're from a small town or a big city, your presence here means more than you know. And if you'd like to keep hearing stories about kindness, healing, and the quiet strength of everyday people, feel free to subscribe. We'd be honored to have you with us on this journey. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. From our hearts to yours, take care, and may you always find light where you least expect it.